Thank you all. How many of you have a Twitter account? Facebook account?
Parlor account.
The very first day of CPAC, if you had been on your Twitter account or your Facebook account, and you tried to click on the CPAC.org link, you got a warning. You are malicious and dangerous. Now, interestingly enough, even though we've had the CPAC.org link for years, both of those tech companies said, oops, that was just a mistake. We didn't actually intend that. Something happened. Very first day of CPAC, that's what we faced. Conservatives know that big tech really does not like us. They're biased against us. They don't like us communicating freely. Yet, it's through these social media platforms that we've been able to get around the media bias that has existed for decades and decades. So, on one hand, we know that big tech is a problem, a serious problem, but on the other hand, it's really been our only solution except for talk radio. How do we get around the media censorship? That is a huge debate now among conservatives. We've got two great conservatives here today with us. Congressman Ken Buck of Colorado, my native state, the author of Capital of Freedom. We were born just 30 miles from each other, maybe. And then, of course, we've got Congressman Darrell Issa here, who is the inventor of 37 patents. Both of these are impressive men. But the question then is, what do we do with big tech, these big platforms? Do we use the power of our antitrust laws and break them up? Or do we identify the particular problems? They're sucking up our data. They're acquiring new companies and getting bigger and bigger. And privacy concerns. What do we do with them? How do we do it? Gentlemen, sometimes you agree and sometimes you disagree.
Well, I'm fortunate to serve on the antitrust subcommittee with Darrell Issa, and I have to tell you, we really have three issues. We have the monopoly issue, we have the speech issue, and we have the privacy issue. And I am focused on the monopoly issue. I believe that if we break these companies up or we create a competition in the marketplace, we will deal to a certain extent with the speech. We need to do things like make sure that a platform like Amazon can't create a product and compete with the company that is actually using Amazon. So it can't be a platform and have a line of business that operates on the platform. Apple can't compete with the apps on the App Store. I think there are a lot of things that we can do to make sure we bring competition in. These are companies that kicked President Trump off their platforms, and yet they let the Ayatollah Khomeini on the platform. These are companies, over 99% of Twitter employees donated to Democrats. We are never going to get a fair shot from these companies. We need to break them up. We need to make sure that we have competition in the marketplace so that we do get a fair shot with one of the companies.
Congressman, I have a follow-up question for you.
Well, and Ken and I agree on a great deal of that. I think the important thing is that even if you disagree on some of the tactics, that you understand, first, Republicans and conservatives have to define that we are at war with these companies. And undeniably, they are monopolies. Everything else, all the other tactics flow from those two truisms, that they do oppose us ideologically, and they have a monopoly which they have been abusing.
Look, they've got power. They do not like us. We know what the problems are. But by breaking them up, do we solve the problem?
Well, the question is, if we have more MSNBCs and CNNs and the rest of the mainstream media, do we in fact accomplish anything? Or is what we need to do to make sure that they can never again shut down a Parler or exclude? I don't mind if there's no Twitter, but when a Jimmy Carter appointee, listen carefully, somebody appointed before 1980 who is still on the court, denied Parler a simple 10 days to make their case for not being shut down and shut out of business by Amazon, they were denied. Can you imagine if the printer refused to print the New York Times and they went for relief, if they would have been able to get that from that same judge? Of course they would. So you know, when we look at making sure that we write laws and enforce them, one of the things we have to do, and this is something Ken and I serve on judiciary, also dealing with the courts, we've got to put an end to people that have been on the bench for 50 years being able to make those kinds of decisions and shutting off the only voice left when the monopolies had shut down the president.
Well, one of the things we want to make sure, and Darrell and I agree about that, but one of the things we want to make sure is that we understand what the unintended consequences are, right, that we have intended consequences. We don't want to create something that's worse than where we are today. I don't know how, but we don't want to do that. And we don't want to start opening up regulation, more regulation, to businesses in this country that are competing because the Democrats want to shut down every big corporation. So I think we have to be really careful. We know what we're doing, and we're aimed directly at these monopolies that are operating in this digital monopoly area.
But one of the problems is Section
230.
I shouldn't call it a problem yet. I'm not going to prejudge it for you two to answer. But Section 230, and this gets kind of complicated, but it basically gives a get-out-of-jail-for-free card to the big tech companies so that if there's something on there that they don't like, they don't have to be held liable for it. But then they're not supposed to be controlling that.
Congressman Chris Cox of California, the real force behind Section 230, had exactly the right reason to pass it. The internet providers should be exactly like the phone company or the trucking company. You can't hold the trucking company responsible for what's inside a box. You can't hold the post office responsible for everything that they ship, and you can't hold the phone companies responsible for what Ken and I say over the phone. That was what it was supposed to do. But today they are in fact picking winners and losers, and they're doing so with so much protection that even the New York Times is easier to sue than Facebook or Twitter, and that's got to change.
They were given this protection with the understanding that they would not censor speech. But now they are censoring speech. Why do they still have this protection? Is that the better solution? Amend Section 230 so that we have a targeted approach, or break them up? Is that a fair question?
A better way to say it in a way is define Section 230. Section 230, according to its authors, was never intended to be anything but a protection for a common carrier, for someone who more or less blindly allowed product to transit the internet. Once they started doing what they're doing, they in fact violated the spirit of 230. And so yes, we are going to have to amend it, but we're going to amend it so basically to have it do what it was supposed to do and no more.
But we also, if you look at newspapers, for example, we've got the Washington Post and we've got the Wall Street Journal. We've got dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of newspapers with different viewpoints. That's healthy. Those newspapers have to be responsible and not promote violent conduct, but at the same time, they can promote different viewpoints. If we had a dozen Facebooks, if we had a dozen Googles, we would be in a similar situation, and it'd be much easier to regulate the kind of publishing content that we're talking about now. Frankly, I think Darrell and I agree, the more information out there, the better. Let the consumer become an informed consumer by seeing different points of view.
Now, we are getting competitors. You mentioned Parler earlier, and we've got CloudHub coming on board. We've got lots of companies that are starting to try to compete against Google and Twitter and Facebook. Isn't that evidence that breaking them up is unwarranted?
This is where Ken and I have some distinction. I want to treat these monopolies like monopolies. I don't personally favor breaking them up. And I always tell the story that when I came to Congress 20 years ago, Sun Micro and other companies were screaming that we had to break up Microsoft because of their dominance on something called Internet Explorer. Today, nobody uses Internet Explorer. It has literally been replaced by multiple other competitors, all of whom are superior. If you can break down the barriers to entry, competition will fix monopolies. The thing that I'm most concerned about is not Facebook and Twitter. The thing I'm most concerned about is here's Amazon Web. They're simply providing computers in the sky, and they made a decision that they had the right to shut off an enterprise who they disagreed with what they were saying, even though what was being said on Parler had less to do with January 6th than what was being said on Facebook and Twitter. And they knew it, and they did it anyway, and that's dangerous.
And they did it because they can collude. The App Store takes them off. If you can't get on an iPhone, your chances of getting out to the public are reduced. But again, and I think Darrell and I agree, the more Googles, whether it happens by breaking them up or whether it happens by creating competition, is beneficial. The problem is that these companies, Google, for example, has a 94% market share of desktop searches. Very difficult to somehow create competition when they own so much of the space.
Now, the Department of Justice currently is suing Google over its practices, I believe. You know, should Congress wait for that litigation to move forward before taking action?
How many decades do you have?
And Ken's exactly right. Should we wait a little while, as long as they're progressing aggressively? Absolutely. But I've got to tell you, the ability of the Biden administration with their puppets in the Department of Justice to slow walk is something that we've dealt with for years. Under Obama, we went 4 years prosecuting Fast and Furious and Eric Holder's own misconduct, and the case was settled after President Trump was sworn in.
Right.
And not just that, but the Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division at the Department of Justice have less real resources today than they had 10 years ago. The companies we're talking about are the largest corporations in the history of the world. To try to compare the ability to fight a lawsuit in court over an extended period of time, it's really a David and Goliath situation.
Yeah, one concern I really have about these tech companies, and this may be a little esoteric, we've always understood what a nation is. Ever since the Treaty of Westphalia, we understood the nation had borders. But today, it seems like Google and Facebook, they're saying a nation is no longer 50 states. A nation is allegiance to them. And if they become a nation, democracy is over, because there is no right to vote. There is no right to appeal in a court system.
There's a reason that Google gets along so well with Red China. And the reason is they love that model. They control the information. Amazon controls the information, Facebook, Twitter, Apple, and if we don't get more diverse information out to the American public, we become whatever Facebook and Google and those companies want us to become. We think because that's the only information we're getting. That's extremely dangerous.
But let me champion one other thought while we're here. Again, 20 years ago, Apple was really dead on its ass. And Microsoft dominated both the PC industry and others dominated the phone industry. Over these 2 decades, Apple has become a $1 trillion plus market cap, most profitable company on earth. They have done a phenomenal job. And today, they're the monopoly that's one of them we're talking about. The one thing that I never want to do is eliminate the ability for that next generation to come up and succeed in America. Because if we get this wrong, then what will happen is a European monopoly, a Chinese monopoly, or monopolies who have no allegiance to the US will in fact dominate and then use these same techniques to preclude any kind of competition here. So make no mistake, the Europeans would like us to overreact. They would like us to overreact because they would like to have an opportunity to have these dominant companies that they've never been able to have because they've never had the freedom for the next generation of ideas to go from startup to $1 trillion. And that's one thing that here at CPAC and in our party, we have to always champion. And Ken and I agree on that. And that's why the tactics we use, we're debating, not the fact that these companies have to, in fact, have real competition that today they don't have.
And the key, I think, in our economy is to make sure we continue to innovate. If we continue to innovate, we dominate the world economy. And the only thing, in my opinion, that harms us from continuing to innovate are these monopolies that squash competition and innovation. If we can find ways to create competition, we will continue to innovate, and we will be the owners of the next generation of this type of technology.
You both have used the word monopoly, but of course monopoly means mono, one.
Well, the federal definition starts with a decision of market power, which can begin as little as 10%. And then the question not to get too technical, but the relevant market. If you go in to a shopping mall, in the shopping mall, the relevant market could be the people that control the mall. So it's very important to not think of a monopoly or a duopoly as per se 100%. The fact is that even if there were 2 companies or 3 companies that dominate and they tend to coordinate, you lose competition. Real competition is defined based on a presence of competition, and you look for what the market is doing. When the market acts like a monopoly, it is a monopoly. When it acts like it's competitive, and we need to make sure that we always define that much more based on that market power and barriers to entry. And right now, market power and barrier to entries are what Ken and I are fighting in Congress.
And if you look at Facebook, for example, when they buy WhatsApp, they're buying the next competitor. And when the government doesn't look at that and give it serious scrutiny, we're taking away the future competition. When they buy Instagram, they are creating, when Google buys YouTube, they are stopping the innovation that we need in the marketplace. 750 mergers, most of them during the Obama administration occurred, and none of them were given the scrutiny that they needed to, and not one of them was taken to court because the law wasn't updated in a way that the regulators could actually win.
I want to go back to a comment you previously made about China. I think one of the best things that the Trump administration did was not merely slow down, but stop Huawei's attacks on American companies, both the hostile takeovers and then some of the nefarious things going on, in terms of espionage. Do you see, Huawei, I think, would be considered a monopoly in China and some parts of the rest of the world. What actions could we take against, we can't call Google an American company, right? It's sort of just everywhere. How does that, the Huawei impact your thinking on what we do to Google and those sorts of platforms?
Well, and before we leave Huawei, one of the things that's important to understand is they were such a dominant monopoly that even when President Trump says we got to shut them off, we had to make exceptions because without some of their products, we had no products. And that means we had given up the ability to have a second source time and time again. So just as they had the ability to force us to not completely shut them down, in spite of their bad acting, we have the same situation. If I asked everyone out there to raise their hand and say, what product do you use to make a phone call that is not either Google-based or Apple-based, the only people raising their hands have a flip phone. How many flip phones are out there? I see no hands.
I see 2.
I see 2.
I see 2 hands.
But the reality...
One of those flip phones was shining here, so I could see it very clearly.
Exactly. But that's how bad it's become in the question of those operating systems, is that there is no competition except for my mother, 88-year-old mother's flip phone. We have to find a way to tear down the barriers to make sure that American innovators can get into this market. And one of the ways is for everyone in this audience to own their data, to own their ability to demand that it be portable, that Facebook never be able to say, if you leave us, you leave with nothing. No, every point of contact you have on your Facebook or Twitter account is your asset.
How many of you believe you should be able to control your own data, your private data? I think you're a winner on that. You are the most senior Republican on the relevant committee here. Do you have a last thought to share with us?
Well, thank you. I was just going to agree with Darrell again, but I think that when you look at Huawei, you're looking, and you look at the Chinese Communist Party, there is no daylight between those two. When you're operating as a Chinese company, you're operating directly at the direction of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been a very good discussion. These antitrust laws, these big platforms, we've got to figure out what we're going to do to protect our rights, to protect our privacy, to protect us from the different kinds of harm they intend to cause us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.